It's summer 1943, and the bodies appeared on the streets of Calcutta. Emaciated figures the Famine Inquiry Commission would later describe as living skeletons filled emergency hospitals and died on sidewalks in India's second-largest city. By November 1943, starvation deaths would peak at levels that killed 3 million people in 6 months. But here's what makes the Bengal famine different from every other famine in modern Indian history. It wasn't caused by drought. Bengal received above-average rainfall in 1943. Soil moisture was normal to above normal. A 2019 scientific study analyzing 146 years of famine data found that the Bengal famine was the only major famine between 1870 and 2016 that was not linked to crop failure from lack of water. The researchers studied 6 major Indian famines during that period. F5 showed clear correlation with drought and soil moisture deficits. Bengal 1943 was the exception. The study concluded this was a unique famine caused by policy failure instead of any drought. The famine was a policy failure. British colonial authorities diverted food from Bengal to build stockpiles in the Mediterranean for Europeans who had not yet been liberated. They denied shipping requests that could have brought relief from Australia and Canada. They implemented and then abandoned price controls that created black markets and hyperinflation. The provincial government never declared an official famine, which prevented automatic relief measures from activating. And Churchill's war cabinet made deliberate decisions, documented in meeting minutes, to prioritize Greeks and military stockpiles over starving Bengalis. And Churchill's personal views shaped the decisions. In war cabinet meetings, he blamed the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits. When told of mass starvation, he asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the shortage was really so severe. Field Marshal Wavell, who became viceroy in October 1943, recorded in his diary that Churchill drew harrowing pictures of British workmen in rags being exploited by rich Indian mill owners, inverting the actual power dynamic of empire while millions of poor Bengalis starved. This video is about what happens when those with power decide some lives matter less than others. Food existed, markets existed, shipping existed. But colonial economic extraction and wartime priorities meant 3 million Bengalis starved to death, while rice was exported from their province and grain ships were diverted to stockpile food for Europeans. The Bengal famine demonstrates that in the modern era, mass starvation is not a natural disaster, but a choice made by governments with the resources to prevent it and choosing not to. To understand how the famine happened, you need to understand what Bengal looked like in 1943 and what structural vulnerabilities had been building for decades under British colonial rule. Bengal in the early 20th century was one of the most densely populated regions in the world, with an agricultural economy that had been systematically reshaped by colonial policies to serve British interests rather than Bengali food security. From the late 19th century through the Great Depression, economic forces had created a class structure where millions of Bengalis held little or no land. The Famine Inquiry Commission found that landless agricultural laborers suffered by far the most of every form of impoverishment and death during 1943. This class had been created by decades of policies that alienated peasants from their land holdings. They increased household debt and created rapid population growth without corresponding increases in agricultural productivity. Muslim inheritance practices that divided land among multiple siblings compounded this, creating smaller and smaller plots that couldn't support families. Bengal's economy was heavily dependent on rice, and rice moved primarily by water transport through the vast delta system and river networks. Roads were scarce and in poor condition. The railway system, built primarily to extract resources and move goods to ports for export, was not designed to distribute food within Bengal during emergencies. When crisis came, the infrastructure to move grain from surplus areas to deficit areas simply didn't exist in sufficient capacity. And British colonial economic policy had also made Bengal dependent on rice imports from Burma to cover shortfalls in years of below-average harvest. Burma had been exporting hundreds of thousands of tons of rice to Bengal annually, which meant that Bengal's food security was tied to a supply chain that could be severed if anything happened to Burma. In May 1942, Japan occupied Burma. The rice imports stopped completely. Bengal lost its safety valve. The final structural vulnerability was the absence of any effective disaster response system. Unlike famines in the 1870s, when the British government had implemented relief measures and imported grain, by 1943, the colonial administration had atrophied. In the 1873-74 famine, about 25 million people were affected, but mortality was almost negligible because the government imported food from Burma and provided relief aid. By 1943, those mechanisms either didn't exist or weren't being used. The provincial government of Bengal was reluctant to acknowledge crisis because declaring famine would reflect poorly on their governance, and the viceroy's government in Delhi was slow to intervene. By early 1943, Bengal had a landless rural underclass with no buffer against food price increases, a transportation system inadequate for emergency redistribution, dependence on rice imports that had been cut off by Japanese occupation, and a colonial administration that prioritized maintaining appearances over saving Bengali lives. The stage was set. All that was needed was a trigger. If this kind of economic history is what you're here for, subscribe now. We cover one story like this every day. October 16, 1942, and a massive cyclone struck southwestern Bengal. The cyclone brought tidal waves and flooding that destroyed rice crops in the coastal districts, killed an estimated 14,500 people directly, destroyed livestock, contaminated water supplies with salt water, and destroyed homes and granaries. The winter rice crop, which would have been harvested in December 1942 and provided food through spring 1943, was destroyed in the affected districts. The cyclone would have been manageable under normal circumstances. Bengal had experienced cyclones before, and the affected area was only a portion of the province. But October 1942 was not normal circumstances. Japan had occupied Burma in May 1942 and was threatening to invade Bengal itself. Japanese planes had bombed Calcutta. Japanese submarines were patrolling the Bay of Bengal. The British military believed invasion was imminent and implemented what they called denial policies, systematic destruction of Bengali resources to prevent the Japanese from using them. The denial policies were comprehensive. Boats were confiscated or destroyed along the coast to prevent Japanese forces from using them for invasion or supply. This destroyed the fishing industry and eliminated the primary means of transportation in the riverine delta regions. Rice stocks in coastal areas were confiscated or destroyed. The British military removed or destroyed anything that could aid Japanese forces, which had the effect of removing or destroying the exact resources Bengali civilians needed to survive the cyclone's aftermath and the coming months. And the denial policies combined with the cyclone damage created the initial conditions for crisis, but the situation was still manageable. Bengal's total rice production in 1943 was only about 5% below normal, a shortfall that proper distribution and imports could have easily covered. Nobel Prize-winning economist Amartya Sen analyzed district-level data and found that food availability in 1943 was actually higher than in 1941, when there was no famine. The problem was not absolute shortage, but distribution failure and panic-driven market dynamics. Refugees from Burma flooded into Bengal throughout 1942 and 1943, bringing hundreds of thousands of additional people who needed food, with no corresponding increase in supply. The Burmese refugees competed for food in markets that were already stressed by the cyclone damage and denial policies. Prices began rising in late 1942 and early 1943. The provincial government's response to rising prices made everything worse. They implemented price controls on rice in early 1943, setting maximum prices below market clearing levels. Farmers and merchants could make more profit by withholding rice and selling on black markets than by selling at the controlled price. Rice disappeared from legal markets. A black market developed with prices far higher than the controlled price. In March 1943, the government abandoned price controls because they clearly weren't working. The result was hyperinflation. Rice prices surged from already elevated levels to catastrophic levels within weeks. Landless agricultural laborers, whose wages had not kept pace with food price inflation, could no longer afford to buy rice at any price. They began to starve. The famine had begun, and that's when the British colonial government made the decisions that turned a manageable crisis into a catastrophe that would kill 3 million people. The famine reached Calcutta by summer 1943. Bodies appeared on the streets, emergency hospitals filled with emaciated victims. In July 1943, reports of mass starvation began reaching London. The Viceroy, Lord Linlithgow, sent urgent messages to the War Cabinet requesting grain shipments and relief supplies. The War Cabinet, chaired by Winston Churchill, had to decide: divert shipping to bring grain to Bengal, or maintain current allocations to build stockpiles in the Mediterranean and supply the military. They chose the stockpiles. War Cabinet minutes from late July and early August 1943 show deliberate decisions to deny Bengal's requests. Churchill's position, as documented by Field Marshal Wavell, was that Greeks and other Europeans should receive priority over underfed Bengalis. Leopold Amery, Secretary of State for India, argued for sending relief. Churchill's advisors questioned whether the famine was even real or just Indian hoarding and mismanagement. Lord Cherwell, Churchill's close scientific advisor, suggested they should attempt to bluff Indian hoarders by announcing grain imports were coming to bring prices down, without actually sending grain. The theory was that if hoarders thought prices would fall, they would sell their stocks, which would bring prices down, without Britain having to divert any shipping. It was market psychology theory being tested on a province where people were starving to death on the streets. The War Cabinet's official position was that shipping was the constraint. Every ship diverted to carry grain to Bengal was a ship not available for the war effort in Europe or the Pacific. This was technically true. Shipping was extremely limited in 1943, with German U-boats sinking merchant vessels in the Atlantic and Japanese submarines in the Indian Ocean. But the question was not whether shipping was limited. The question was whether starving Bengalis should have priority over stockpiling food for Greeks and Yugoslavs who had not yet been liberated from Axis occupation. Churchill's personal views shaped the decision-making in ways that went beyond strategic calculation. In War Cabinet meetings, he drew what Wavell described as harrowing pictures of British workmen in rags being exploited by rich Indian mill owners, inverting the actual power dynamic of empire while landless Bengali laborers were dying in the streets. He blamed the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits, using Malthusian arguments that frame mass starvation as a natural consequence of overpopulation rather than a policy failure. When told of the famine's severity, Churchill asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the shortage was really that bad. He treated the survival of a 73-year-old political leader who had access to resources as evidence that reports of mass starvation among landless agricultural laborers were exaggerated. The logic was absurd, but it served the purpose of avoiding action. Author Madhusri Mukherjee, who examined War Cabinet minutes for her book Churchill's Secret War, documented that Churchill deliberately ordered the diversion of food from starving Indian civilians to well-supplied British soldiers and to build stockpiles meant for yet-to-be-liberated Europeans. The decisions were not made in ignorance. By August 1943, the War Cabinet had detailed reports of mass starvation. Linlithgow had provided death toll estimates and photographic evidence. The decision to prioritize European stockpiles over Bengal relief was made with full knowledge that Bengalis were dying and that grain was available in Australia, but shipping was being allocated elsewhere. India was already exporting rice during the famine. Between January and July 1943, as the famine set in, India exported more than 70,000 tons of rice. Its food was being shipped out of Bengal for military use, while Bengalis starved. The War Cabinet continued this policy even after acknowledging the famine's severity. Between July and October 1943, as the famine peaked and killed hundreds of thousands per month, the British War Cabinet sent limited relief while continuing to allocate most available shipping to Mediterranean stockpiles and military supply lines. The dying continued. By late summer 1943, the famine had become a humanitarian catastrophe, visible to anyone in Bengal. Skeletal figures wandered into Calcutta from rural areas, collapsing on sidewalks. The Famine Inquiry Commission that investigated afterward described victims as resembling living skeletons, people so emaciated that their bones were visible through their skin, with muscles wasted to almost nothing. Emergency hospitals filled beyond capacity. Doctors and nurses worked with inadequate supplies to treat victims of advanced starvation. The mortality pattern followed a specific trajectory that the Famine Inquiry Commission documented in detail. From May to October 1943, starvation was the principal cause of excess mortality. People who had sold everything they owned to buy food, who had exhausted all their resources, it simply ran out of calories and starved. Rural landless laborers died first and died fastest because they had no assets to sell and no land to fall back on. The commission found that while some districts of Bengal were relatively less affected throughout the crisis, no demographic or geographic group was completely immune to increased mortality rates. But deaths from starvation were heavily concentrated among the rural poor. Urban areas and wealthier populations had access to rations and could afford inflated prices. Starvation deaths peaked in November 1943. By this point, hundreds of thousands had already died, and the survivors had weakened immune systems that made them vulnerable to disease. Around October 1943, disease began its sharp upward turn. By December 1943, disease overtook starvation as the most common cause of death. Disease-related mortality then continued through early to mid-1944. Malaria was the biggest killer among diseases. From July 1943 to June 1944, the monthly death toll from malaria averaged 125% above rates from the previous 5 years, reaching 203% above average in December 1943. Malaria parasites were found in nearly 52% of blood samples examined at Calcutta hospitals during the peak period in November to December 1943. The Famine Inquiry Commission noted that statistics for malaria deaths were almost certainly inaccurate since the symptoms often resemble those of other fatal fevers, but there was little doubt it was the main killer. Other famine-related deaths resulted from dysentery and diarrhea, typically through consumption of poor-quality food or deterioration of the digestive system caused by malnutrition. Cholera spread through contaminated water systems that had broken down during the crisis. The disease was associated with social disruption, poor sanitation, contaminated water, crowded living conditions in refugee camps, and wandering populations. Problems brought on after the October 1942 cyclone and flooding and continuing through the crisis. The death toll from disease continued through the first half of 1944, long after starvation deaths had peaked and declined. This is why estimates of total famine mortality vary widely. If you count only direct starvation deaths from May to November 1943, the toll is in the hundreds of thousands. If you include disease deaths that were caused by malnutrition and famine-related social breakdown through mid-1944, the toll reaches 3 million or higher. The most commonly cited figure is 3 million, which the Famine Inquiry Commission considered conservative. While Bengalis were dying at these rates, rice continued to be exported from Bengal for military use. Food continued to be diverted to build stockpiles in the Mediterranean. The provincial government still had not declared an official famine, which meant automatic relief measures had not been triggered, and the War Cabinet in London continued to prioritize other demands on shipping over Bengal relief. October 1943, and Churchill finally replaced Lord Linlithgow as Viceroy with Field Marshal Wavell. Wavell arrived in India, toured Bengal, saw the catastrophe firsthand, and immediately understood that the crisis required massive intervention that the War Cabinet had been refusing to authorize. Within days of taking office, Wavell requested 1 million tons of grain to be shipped to Bengal immediately. He sent urgent cables to London describing conditions in graphic detail and requesting immediate relief. Wavell's appointment marked a turning point, but the turning point came too late. Starvation deaths had already peaked in November 1943. By the time Wavell took office in October and began pushing for relief, hundreds of thousands had already died, and many more were in advanced stages of starvation that would kill them regardless of intervention. The disease wave that would eventually kill more people than starvation itself was already beginning its upward curve. The British Indian Army took control of famine relief funding in October 1943, and relief efforts improved significantly compared to the provincial government's ineffective earlier response. Military logistics and organization brought some order to the chaos of distribution, but effective relief in sufficient quantity did not arrive until after the peak starvation period had passed. Between August 1943, when the War Cabinet first acknowledged the severity of the famine, and the end of 1944, more than 1 million tons of grain were eventually sent to Bengal. Some came from Australia on Australian ships. Some came from Allied Southeast Asia Command. Some came from stockpiles that had been built for other purposes but were eventually redirected. But the majority of this grain arrived in 1944, after starvation deaths had peaked. To address disease deaths and prevent the famine from recurring in 1944-45. Churchill's defenders point to the eventual 1 million tons of grain as evidence that he did not deliberately starve Bengal and that the delays were due to legitimate shipping constraints rather than callous indifference. But the timeline undermines that defense completely. Between July and October 1943, when deaths were at their peak, the War Cabinet sent limited relief while maintaining allocations for Mediterranean stockpiles. Only after Wavell's appointment and his repeated urgent requests did substantial grain shipments begin. By then, hundreds of thousands had already died needlessly. The counterfactual is clear and devastating. If the War Cabinet had diverted shipping to send grain in July or August 1943, when Linlithgow first reported the crisis, starvation deaths in the peak period of September-November could have been prevented. The decision to prioritize stockpiles for Europeans over immediate relief for starving Bengalis was a choice, and that choice killed people. The War Cabinet chose to wait and see if the crisis would resolve itself, chose to test market psychology theories instead of sending food, chose to maintain stockpiles for Europeans who were still under occupation instead of feeding Bengalis who were dying in the present. By the time substantial relief arrived in late 1943 and 1944, the famine had already done its worst damage. Disease would continue killing through mid-1944, but many of those disease deaths were among people whose immune systems had been destroyed by the starvation period that could have been prevented with earlier intervention. In 2019, researchers from the Indian Institute of Technology, Gandhinagar, UCLA, and the Indian Meteorological Department published a study in the journal Geophysical Research Letters that provided scientific backing for what historians had been arguing for decades. The Bengal famine was not caused by drought or crop failure, but by policy decisions. The researchers analyzed soil moisture data from 1870 to 2016, covering nearly 150 years of Indian agricultural history. They studied 6 major famines in India between 1873 and 1943. The methodology was straightforward. Reconstruct agricultural drought conditions by analyzing soil moisture databases to see which famines correlated with drought and crop failure, and which did not. 5 of the 6 famines showed clear correlation with soil moisture deficits and drought conditions. The 1873-74 famine, the 1876 famine, the 1877 famine, the 1896-97 famine, and the 1899 famine all appeared to be linked, at least in part, to widespread drought and agricultural failure. The Bengal famine of 1943 was the exception. Lead researcher Vimal Mishra stated the findings directly. This was a unique famine, caused by policy failure instead of any drought. The study found that the famine-affected region of Bengal received above-normal precipitation between June and September of 1943, precisely the critical monsoon growing season. Soil moisture levels were normal to above normal throughout the famine period. There was no evidence of agricultural drought in the regions where people were starving. The conclusion was unequivocal. The Bengal famine was likely caused by other factors related at least in part to the ongoing Asian theater of World War II, including malaria, starvation, and malnutrition. This was the only famine that does not appear to be linked directly to soil, moisture drought, and crop failures. The scientific evidence confirmed what economist Amartya Sen had argued in 1981. Sen's analysis of district-level agricultural data showed that food availability in Bengal in 1943 was significantly higher than in 1941, when there was no famine. Sen concluded that the problem was not absolute food shortage, but what he called entitlement failure, a breakdown in the economic and political systems that determine who has access to food. In a functioning system, with adequate distribution and purchasing power, the approximately 5% production shortfall in 1943 could have been easily managed through imports and redistribution. Instead, Policy failures turned a manageable shortfall into mass starvation. The failures were multiple and compounding. The cyclone and denial policies created initial disruption. Price controls created black markets and hoarding. Abandonment of price controls created hyperinflation. Failure to declare official famine prevented relief activation. Interprovincial trade barriers prevented grain movement within India. Continued rice exports took food out of Bengal. And War Cabinet refusal to divert shipping meant the one intervention that could have quickly addressed the crisis was delayed until hundreds of thousands had died. The 2019 study eliminated the last possible natural explanation. The drought didn't happen. But the crop failure wasn't sufficient to cause famine on this scale. The rainfall was above average. The famine was entirely a product of human decisions made by people with the power to prevent it who chose not to. The scientific evidence provided definitive proof of what the historical record had already shown. 3 million people died because of policy choices, not natural disaster. Understanding why Churchill and the War Cabinet made the decisions they made requires understanding the racist ideology that shaped British imperial attitudes toward Indians in the 1940s. Churchill's views on India and Indians were not subtle or concealed. They were explicitly racist, documented in his own words in War Cabinet meetings, personal letters, and conversations with colleagues documented by witnesses. And his racism shaped policy decisions that cost 3 million lives. Churchill called Indians a beastly people with a beastly religion. He blamed the famine on Indians breeding like rabbits, invoking Malthusian theories of overpopulation that frame mass starvation as a natural check on excessive reproduction rather than a policy failure requiring intervention. Yet these were not private prejudices. They were views he expressed in official government meetings while making decisions about whether to send relief. The racism operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the most explicit level, there was direct devaluation of Indian lives relative to European lives. Leopold Amory recorded Field Marshal Wavell's observation that Churchill believed it was more important to save the Greeks and liberated countries than the Indians. Lord Cherwell's comment prioritizing sturdy Greeks over underfed Bengalis captured the racial hierarchy perfectly. Europeans were worth more, and therefore European needs took precedence even when those needs were future and hypothetical, while Indian needs were immediate and fatal. At a deeper level, there was the assumption embedded throughout British imperial administration that Indians were inherently incapable of governing themselves, and that any problems in India were caused by Indian failures rather than British policy. Leopold Amory initially took what he himself described as a lofty Malthusian view that India was overpopulated, and that the best strategy was to do nothing and let nature take its course. The provincial government of Bengal never declared an official famine, partly because doing so would reflect poorly on British governance and undermine the legitimacy of colonial rule. At the deepest level, there was the colonial mindset that India existed to serve British interests, which meant that Indian resources, including food, could legitimately be extracted to support British war aims even if that extraction killed Indians. This was not a new principle in 1943. It was the operating logic of British rule in India for 2 centuries. What made 1943 different was the scale and the documentation. The War Cabinet minutes provide a paper trail showing exactly how the extraction logic operated during a humanitarian catastrophe. Churchill's views found support throughout the British ruling class. War Cabinet member after War Cabinet member expressed skepticism about whether the famine was real or whether it was being exaggerated by Indian nationalists for political purposes. British officials in India sent reports to London that were designed to minimize alarm rather than convey the full scope of the catastrophe, all because acknowledging the scale of the crisis would have required acknowledging the failure of British governance. The racism was structural, not just personal. Even officials who were not personally hostile to Indians operated within a system that treated Indian lives as less valuable than British interests. The famine happened during a war where Britain was fighting for its survival against Nazi Germany, which meant that the imperial logic of resource extraction was operating at maximum intensity. Food produced in India was treated as a resource that could legitimately be used for British war aims, and the fact that Bengalis would starve if that food was taken was treated as an unfortunate but acceptable cost of maintaining the empire and winning the war. Churchill's war cabinet operated with a clear hierarchy of priorities: British survival first, Allied European survival second, colonial subjects distant third. When shipping was scarce and choices had to be made, that hierarchy determined who lived and who died. 3 million Bengalis died because they were at the bottom of that hierarchy. The Bengal famine was not Britain's first colonial famine caused by food exports during mass starvation. Nearly a century earlier, the Irish famine of 1845-1852 had killed approximately 1 million people, while Ireland continued exporting food to Britain throughout the famine years. The parallel is not approximate, it is exact in structure. Both were colonies where land was used to produce food for British consumption, while the colonized population starved. Both involved British officials blaming victims for overpopulation and moral failing, and both demonstrate that British colonial policy treated famine as acceptable collateral damage of imperial resource extraction. Ireland under British rule operated on a system where Protestant landlords controlled the land, and Catholic peasants worked as tenants producing food for export to Britain. When the potato blight struck in 1845, destroying the potato crop that Irish peasants depended on for subsistence, food continued to be exported from Ireland throughout the famine. Grain, livestock, and dairy products were shipped from Irish ports to Britain, while Irish peasants starved in ditches. British officials blamed Irish overpopulation and dependence on a single crop, framed relief as encouraging dependency, and allowed 1 million people to die rather than interfere with the market system that was profiting British landlords. The pattern repeated in Bengal with precision. The colonial economic system had oriented Bengal's agriculture toward producing rice for export and supporting British administrative and military needs. When crisis came, the system prioritized British interests, in this case the war effort and European stockpiles, over Bengali survival. British officials blamed Bengali overpopulation and mismanagement, rather than examining whether the colonial system itself that had created the vulnerability that made famine possible. The Irish famine shaped how Britain thought about famine relief in colonies for the next century. The doctrine that emerged was that government should not interfere with market mechanisms, that relief should be minimal to avoid creating dependency, and that famine was often a natural consequence of overpopulation that would self-correct through mortality. These principles, developed during the Irish famine and codified in British colonial administration, had meant that by 1943, the system had no institutional capacity or political will for the kind of large-scale relief intervention that could have prevented mass death in Bengal. Economic historian Vikram Doctor explained the pattern. Ireland was the UK's first colony, where it learned how to extract value from people who were denied political power. The value came from its land, which was used to produce food for the UK, while political power was denied. That extraction model was then applied across the British Empire, from Ireland to India to Africa, with famines occurring whenever extraction continued during agricultural stress. The comparison reveals that the Bengal famine was not an aberration or a unique failure, but an expression of how the British Empire had always functioned. Colonial economic systems were designed to extract resources from colonies to metropole. When crisis made that extraction lethal, the system continued operating because preserving the extraction was more important to imperial administrators than preserving colonized lives. The Bengal famine did not kill randomly. It killed systematically along class lines, with mortality heavily concentrated among the landless rural poor, while wealthier Bengalis and the colonial administrative class remained largely unaffected. Understanding who died reveals how famine operates as an economic and political phenomenon rather than a simple food shortage. The Famine Inquiry Commission found that landless agricultural laborers suffered by far the most of every form of impoverishment and death. These were people who owned no land, had no assets to sell, and depended entirely on wage labor to buy food in markets. When food prices surged in early 1943, their wages did not keep pace. They could not afford to buy rice at inflated prices. They had nothing to sell to raise money for food. They starved first and died fastest. Small tenant farmers died next. These were people with small landholdings or sharecropping arrangements who produced some food but not enough to feed their families through the year, and had to buy supplemental rice in markets. When prices surged, their small assets, tools, livestock, household goods, could buy food for a while. But once those assets were sold, they had nothing left. They sold everything they owned, spent every resource trying to survive, and then starved. Meanwhile, the privileged classes in Calcutta, who were important to the war effort, were supported by guaranteed rations. The colonial administrative class, British officials, military personnel, and Indians employed in essential war work received guaranteed food allocations, regardless of market prices. They did not starve. Wealthier Bengalis who owned land, operated businesses, or had savings could afford to pay the inflated prices, or had stockpiles of rice from previous harvests. They did not starve. The class segregation of famine mortality was a deliberate policy choice, not an accident. Churchill's war cabinet explicitly decided, as documented in meeting minutes, that those with direct contribution to the war effort would be fed while others would not. This was not informal triage in the chaos of crisis. It was official policy implemented through the rationing system. Essential workers received rations. The economically marginal population did not. The fact that 3 million died while British officials and wealthier Bengalis remained well-fed demonstrates conclusively that the famine was not caused by absolute food shortage. If there had been no food available at any price, and everyone would have starved proportionally. Instead, the famine killed selectively based on who could access food through economic or political means. The system allocated scarce food to those considered valuable to the empire while letting everyone else die. This is what Amartya Sen meant by entitlement failure. The problem was not that food didn't exist. The problem was that the economic and political systems that determine who can access food broke down for the rural poor while continuing to function for the privileged classes. Food was in the markets. It was in stockpiles. It was being exported. But landless laborers had no entitlement to it because they had no money to buy it and no political importance to the empire that would get them rations. The class dimension of the famine reveals its true nature. This was not nature killing indiscriminately. This was a system killing the people it considered expendable while protecting the people it needed. The Bengal famine killed 3 million people between 1943 and 1944. It was not caused by drought. Bengal received above-average rainfall and had normal soil moisture throughout the crisis. It was not caused by absolute food shortage. Bengal's production was only 5% below normal, and food availability in 1943 was higher than in 1941 when there was no famine. It was caused by British colonial policies that diverted food from Bengal to build stockpiles for Europeans, denied shipping to bring relief despite repeated urgent requests, implemented and abandoned price controls that created hyperinflation, and prioritized war effort and imperial extraction over 3 million Bengali lives. Churchill's war cabinet made deliberate decisions that are documented in meeting minutes preserved in British archives. They chose to let Bengalis starve rather than divert ships from Mediterranean stockpiles. They chose to believe that reports of mass starvation were exaggerated propaganda. They chose to prioritize sturdy Greeks over underfed Bengalis. They chose to test market psychology theories instead of sending food. These were choices made by people with power who valued some lives more than others based on race and colonial hierarchy. The 2019 scientific study eliminated any remaining doubt about causation. The drought didn't happen. The crop failure was manageable. The famine was policy failure. Researcher Vimal Mishra stated it directly. This was a unique famine, caused by policy failure instead of any drought. The Bengal famine demonstrates that in the modern era, a mass starvation is not a natural disaster, but a failure of political will and a choice made by governments with resources to prevent death and choosing not to. Food existed in Australia and Canada. Markets existed to distribute it. Shipping existed to transport it. What was missing was the political decision to treat Bengali lives as worth saving at the cost of inconveniencing British military logistics or delaying European stockpiles. The pattern repeats across colonial famines: Ireland in the 1840s, Bengal in the 1940s, and later famines in Africa and Asia, where colonial or authoritarian governments allow populations to starve while resources are extracted or diverted to serve the interests of those with power. The Bengal famine is not ancient history. It happened within living memory. There are still people alive today whose parents or grandparents lived through it or died in it. And it is evidence of what happens when those who control food distribution systems decide that some people's survival is less important than other priorities. When power is sufficiently concentrated and accountability is sufficiently absent, mass death becomes acceptable as a cost of maintaining that power. The Bengal famine is a template for understanding how modern famines work, not as natural disasters, but as political choices made by governments that value preservation of their own power and interests more than the lives of the people they govern. Subscribe to The Economic Record. Tomorrow, we cover the Long Depression of 1873 to 1896, the 23-year economic crisis that nobody talks about.